fanfare for the common man. Quite well-known sports theme on Channel 7. And when you mention 7 and when you mention television, one name is synonymous. And I'm happy to welcome to the studios to talk to me, Gordon Bennett.
Alex, good morning.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. And I tell you what, listening to that theme brings back a lot of memories because we got that theme many years ago, but we adapted it from the length that it is now down to 5 seconds intro.
Exactly right. I remember it very well. In fact, one of my great loves is radio and television themes. And of course, 7 had its fair share back in those days.
We had just the best themes, and we brought out albums of those themes. And in the days of the football, when I was involved in the football, we had great themes, and Up There Kazali, which was one of 7's big ones.
That's right.
But all the themes, we worked a lot on the themes, and we used like the Bradys and the Greg Champions to write them and make them for us. And it just gave us that little edge because as soon as a theme played, people stopped and listened if they were in another room, and then they'd come in and watch. And that was the theory of it. But I'm afraid today, you know, the themes are just sort of modern and ordinary.
Yes, and electronic, a lot of it.
That's right.
Which is sad. These themes that we're talking about here, and I love mood music, and the libraries like Chappell and FDH, Boozy and Hawkes, Paxton, all issued those wonderful, a lot of 78s back in the early days, and then of course on vinyl later, to radio and television, and they weren't available to the general public. And my first Chappell 78 was given to me by one of the engineers at 3DB, and it was Grandstand, which was their sporting theme.
Yes, I remember it well.
And a little bird tells me that you were wanting to get into radio through 3DB. Was that right?
Yes. What happened 58 years ago
58
was I heard on the 3DB breakfast session that they were wanting a turntable operator, a good young kid to spin in their discs.
Which is what they did back in those days.
That's right. And I'd had a great love for listening to radio, and especially 3DB, and listening to Ron Casey and his fights and all that sort of stuff. And I was only 14 at the time, and unbeknownst to my parents, I rang through the number, it was MF something, and I spoke to the accountant, and he said, "Oh yes, come in and we'll talk to you." Well, I had to tell my parents because Dad had to take me in because being 14 at the time and travelling on the trains and everything. Anyway, wandered in, saw the accountant, and everything sounded good. And I went home quite confident, and then got the phone call saying you missed out on the job.
Oh, really?
And I thought, oh, this is just terrible. Anyway, I went back to school, and I was at school for a couple of weeks later. The accountant from a place called HSV7 rang and spoke to my mother. He said it was a television station that belonged to the Herald and Weekly Times, and would your son still be interested in a job as an office boy? So I got home, and Mum said, I've made an appointment, you can go in tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So in with Dad I went, and Dad said, I'm staying outside. And just before I went in, he said, now listen, I want you to shake hands with me. So I shook hands, and he said, no, it's firmer. And I said, right. And he said, now off you go. So of course, when I went in and met the accountant, a gentleman called Adrian Miller, and I shook hands, I shook very firmly. And we sat down and we talked for about an hour. Mm-hmm. And he said, you've got the job, when can you start? I said, when do you want me? He said, tomorrow morning. So I went home and I said to Mum, can you ring the school and say I'm coming to collect my books? This must have been a bit of a heart-wrencher for my parents, because at the age of 14,
yes,
to leave school and go to work. Anyway, it all happened, and I started the next morning. I think it was August the 7th, 1956, and it was before television went on air.
That's right, because that was going to be later in the year with the Olympic Games.
Yes, they went on air on November 4, and the Olympic Games were later in that month.
That's right.
And so I was able to take it all in because I knew nothing about television. I didn't really know what the word meant. And here I was in a big building that was being renovated and rebuilt, and seeing all this magic equipment going in and seeing pictures on television screens. I'd never sort of seen all this. And anyway, I got stuck in, and because I was, prior to this, I was the lolly boy at the Surrey Hills Independent Theatre in Surrey Hills.
Yes.
And I used to go there of a night and carry the tray into the theatre, sell the sweets, and then go back at interval and do the same thing. But after when the curtains opened at the beginning, I used to sit there and watch the newsreels, and I used to think these newsreels were something else again. And all I wanted to do in my life was to become a newsreel photographer.
Right.
Channel 7 allowed this to happen because for the first 12 months of my office boy job, I went out on Saturdays and Sundays with the cameramen, the film cameramen, and learned how to use the cameras, learned how to use the film and all about it. So that was at the age of 14, and at the age of 15, I was still the office boy, but I had all that knowledge.
What a wonderful thing that must have been.
Well,
it was something that you wanted. You'd seen back at the cinemas in the old days, and here you were.
Well, it was an amazing thing, and the more I think about it now, I used to travel to work every day, and the Saturday and Sunday by train from the Surrey Hills station. And would you believe I've now decided to go by train, which I'm still working in at Channel 7, and I sit there and I go through the Surrey Hills railway station, and all these memories flood back of the selling of the newspapers, then going and selling the sweets in the theatre, watching the newsreels, going up and rewinding some of the films for them. I had this great feel for film. So after 12 months as the office boy, they then let me go into the film processing area, which meant that we had a photographer there who used to take stills of all the happenings at Channel 7. And I would process all the films and mix the chemicals. So that gave me good grounding in film itself. And I couldn't sort of become a newsreel cameraman for another 3 years because I had to wait until I was 18 until I could get a licence to drive the car.
Drive, of course, yes.
But if anything happened in the city, like there were a couple of major fires and the cameramen were elsewhere, my boss would come and say, well, here's the way to go and see whether you can do it. Gave me an old Paleyard Bolex camera, and I went up to the city by tram, filmed the fire, came back and sweated it out until it was processed. Then I'd watch it being edited. Then I'd sit in the control room at 7 because we didn't have a television set at home, and I'd watch my own handiwork, and I tell you what, that was something else again.
What a thrill. What a thrill. I mean, it was those early days when television first came out, not many places had TV sets. I can remember people would be sitting outside of shops.
That is correct. I'm doing a bit of research on the Olympic Games in 1956. Channel 7 have asked me to address their sales staff and tell them about the history of Seven's involvement with the Olympic Games. And I was searching back through some old notes that I had, and it was mentioned that at the time of the Olympic Games, there were 5,000 television sets sold in Melbourne alone. You're correct about the standing outside the shops, which I would do. I remember after work, I would go up and stand outside Myers where they had television sets and just watch what was happening, because that was the only way I could see what they were doing at the station. And would you believe that I now know that Mr. Stokes, who owns the network, was probably standing next to me in Burke Street watching the same television sets. We've talked about this together, and it is amazing to think he's now got a complete network,
Isn't it?
and
Isn't
I'm
it?
still working for him.
Well, yeah, that's wonderful. I remember in my childhood, we lived in Newport after moving from Yarraville, and I used to go to the Sun Picture Theatre, and they had the St George's there back in those days. But I would go up to my friends, the Jamisons, on Sunday to watch Disneyland, which I think started about 6 o'clock on Sunday night or something like that anyway, on Channel 7. And I'd go up for tea and we'd watch Disneyland, and we would think it was even though it was black and white, it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. It really was.
Well, to sit in your lounge room and watch movies was really unbelievable in my time, because all I'd seen was on the big screens at the theatres, and then to have it in your lounge room, and it wasn't long before Dad said to myself and my brother, he said, "Look, if you give me £50 and my brother gives you £50, I'll put in £50 and we'll buy a Pi 21-inch television set," and that was amazing.
So yours was a Pi. I think our first one was an Astor.
Yes.
That's the difference.
Yes.
Remember those?
That's right.
Catch cries?
Yes.
But they were wonderful days. And even though that was black and white, we still loved it.
That's correct. Just talking about those Astor 17-inch television sets and my research into the Olympics at the moment, back in 1956 when the games were on, Channel 7 and 2 and 9 all showed live coverage of the Olympic Games.
Right.
And there was no way of recording the action. There were no videotapes in those days,
exactly.
not until 65, I think. And what we had to do was set up our film camera in front of an Astor 17-inch set and actually film off that television set. And it was rough and it had hum bars down it. You know, everyone listening to this program would understand the hum bars of those days.
Yeah.
And the quality wasn't so good, but that was all we could do. And that was the only way we could send pictures up to Sydney to be shown in Sydney of the Olympic Games.
Is it Kinescope?
Yeah, kinescopes were there and were ready, but this Channel 7 in Melbourne, they had it in the back room, but it hadn't been set up. Everything else took priority.
Right.
It was set up months later. But anyway, those films still exist in our library, and we've actually put them onto videotape. And back in 2000, with the Sydney Olympics, the NBC network wanted some old material of 1956, and we presented this old film to them, and they just thought this was tremendous. Anyway, they digitised it, fixed it all up. It's as sharp as a tack, and it looks terrific.
Amazing, isn't it? I mean, when you think about what they do now, I mean, last evening you had the tennis was on, and it went round the world.
Yes, that's correct.
In a digital format, and when you go back and think what they used to go through in the old days, it's just the technology we've got now is amazing.
It is sensational. I've set up my phone to watch the tennis on the train going home, and and when I get home, I get the iPad out, and then I can select the programs they're putting to air. Also, programs of the outside courts. You know, there are about 6 or 8 courts that come in direct into your iPad.
I know.
But in those days of the Olympics and the first tennis matches we covered, we only had, well, the station had 6 cameras. 3 cameras were assigned to the OB van, and that's all they had. With the Olympics, they would cover a 3-camera coverage at the MCG of all the events up until 6 o'clock, then pack it all up, drive the OB van around to the swimming pool, set up again to cover the swimming events at night, and then do the same thing the next day.
Did you guys share your cameras?
No, not in those
So
days.
you
There wasn't the technology to be able to do that.
Right. So you all had to do your own broadcasts.
Yes, yes.
Because I suppose now, if you've got a big event on, you can have various stations' cameras if you need a heap of cameras.
Yes, yes. I think they all like to be independent still, but it could happen. Like
Yeah.
if there's a major sort of a funeral of a sporting person, all the stations combine their equipment and it goes out to each station then.
Now, with your role, obviously you've promoted it through the various levels at Channel 7, and you would have come in touch with some of the great names. And we started off with a sporting theme, and my early recollections of a great show on Sunday was World of Sport.
Yes.
And you must have some stories.
Well, I go right back to the start of World of Sport, and it goes back to my years of being able to film, from learning from the cameramen, but not being able to drive. And in those days, there weren't that many cameras, and there weren't that many cameramen. So I became quite friendly with Ron Casey from my days as an office boy up at 3DB, and Ron moved down to 7 to do World of Sport.
Yes, indeed.
I used to film a lot of the segments for him, but he'd have to take me everywhere. So we'd go to the festival hall on a Friday night to cover the boxing, and I'd take all the equipment, but I'd have the equipment waiting outside Channel 7. Ron would pull up in his green Vanguard, we'd stick it in the back, and we'd go to the festival hall. I'd set it all up. He'd go and call the fights for 3DB. I'd film it all and then pack it up, and he'd take me back to Channel 7. I'd pack all the gear away, and then he'd drop me up at the Flinders Street railway station to get the last train home. Now, that happened mainly because, well, I couldn't drive. But Ron would ask me if I would cover the Warrnambool road race with him, and I'd say yes, and I'd travel all the way to Warrnambool in the boot of his car, filming out of the boot, and he would stop at various pubs along the way, not for a drink, but to use their telephone, because there were no mobile telephones, and he had to ring back to 3DB from the fixed lines. Anyway, all the stuff that I was doing for World of Sport was helping me learn more about sport and the coverage of television. And, people would say to me, who won the Warrnambool road race? And I'd say, well, I don't really know, but I know I went out of focus at a certain point in the finish because of so-and-so. So I'd remember all the technicalities, but I wouldn't remember all the results as such.
Exactly.
And World of Sport, that was in 1958, and it was on a Saturday morning, and then it changed to the Sunday morning. Yes. And I eventually got my licence, and I worked with Ron for the next lot of years, just doing stuff for him. And then it became, it was about 1977, and they said to me, are you sick of travelling around the world at the moment? I said, I'm so tired, I just want to stay in Melbourne and work away in Melbourne. And they said, well, look, we'd like you to come and produce all our sports programs, including World of Sport. And then for the next 23 years, that's what I did. And it was just sensational.
That's wonderful.
All because of riding with Ron Casey in the back of his Vanguard.
In the back of his Vanguard. Now, here's a piece of music that you may remember from World of Sport. As I said, I got a great collection of themes. See if you can remember this piece of music. We'll talk about it after. Well, that's called Sports March #1, yes, and that was used for...
The wood chop. You see, I wouldn't remember the original name. I'd just say, can we have the wood chop theme?
Exactly.
And that would come on. The wood chop was quite fantastic. Jack O'Toole
That's right.
organised it for us, and he would arrive with all the competitors on Sunday morning with the logs of wood, which I think he got from the Newgee timber yards. And he would set it all up in the studio in the background while we were doing other things, and that's where a lot of the noise came from. But anyway, we'd have the wood chop and there'd be chips flying all over the place, and I don't think today we'd get away with this.
Probably not.
But the funny thing about the wood chop was Jack had to start the countdown for the boys to start off handicaps, and he'd say, "Axeman, ready, 1, 2, and that happened every week. So we decided to record it on the magnetic tape, which we did, and we would run it every week. Unfortunately, well, when the years got on, Jack passed away. And I rang Jack's wife and said, "Look, would you mind if we still use his voice to introduce the wood chop, because we think it's quite a tribute to him after all these years?"
Yes.
She had no problem. Anyway, so we used it. Then one day, one Sunday afternoon, we used to have a drink in the dressing room after the show, and always had a chat. And Jack Dyer was in there, and Jack said to Louis, "Where's Jack O'Toole? Why isn't he in here? I used to love having a chat to him." And and Louis said, "Jack's been dead for months." No, he can't be. I hear him every morning.
I love it. How priceless is that?
Well, Jack was just an amazing gentleman. He was big and he was tough and he was a great footballer. But in a world of sport, if anyone brought their children in, they would make a beeline for Jack, and Jack would always talk to them and chat and tell them things. But the kids just loved Jack and his personality.
Yeah. Now, there's another piece of music I want to play, just a short piece of it. But there was a bloke called John Dobby. Used to come in and do the bowls.
That's correct.
And it was to this piece of music, which I love. It's wonderful. It's a piece called Sunday Afternoon. And there it was, a piece written by Cyril Ornadell, and the Telecast Orchestra plays it. But John would say, "Oh, no, yes, it's coming down to the jack, and it's just about to glance off."
That's correct. I know World of Sport was a sports program, but the music had a lot to do with it. The theme that we're playing now was quite memorable, and as John Dobie would be doing his commentary on the bowls, he'd be watching the film and doing the commentary, and in the background I kept hearing whistling noise, and I kept saying to the audio, "Is that whistling on the track?" No, it's not on the track. Well, it just happened to be Uncle Doug near his microphone to do his commercials, whistling away to the theme music. I just thought that was amazing when he did that.
Absolutely priceless. Some great memories, and we're very close to running out of time, Gordon, but I wanted to end on a particular piece of music that you said had a connection to, and I think it was was it the wrestling or the boxing?
The boxing.
The boxing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I've already mentioned that going to the boxing with Ron Casey, and I was young and I was still learning it all, and I had all these worries and of setting it all up, which I eventually got used to, and then I'd have to unpack it. And I just recall that when I was packing everything up to leave, there'd be a song playing in the background over the PA system of Festival Hall. The song was just an old bloke, well, I thought he was an old bloke at the time, just singing one of the, it was just a nice song. And one time when I was at the Festival Hall, I went to the guy that played the music and said, "Look, can you tell me what you play after the boxing?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, it's Al Bowley singing Goodnight Sweetheart." And I just fell in love with the piece of music, and it brought back so many memories over the years of what I was doing in those early days. It's always remained a favourite of mine, and I've since found out, after collecting around about 800 copies of Al Bowley songs, that Al Bowley was a boxer in his early days.
He was indeed.
And and that seemed to be the connection, but it just seemed an odd piece of music because it was such a beautiful piece of music to be played after a boxing match.
Well, I think that's the perfect introduction to this piece of music, which will take out this interview. But before I say goodbye, I do want to thank you so very much for giving up your time. I know you're still a busy man at Channel 7, and we had the great pleasure of visiting your organisation late last year, a group of us here, and you were very, very kind to us. And thank you, Gordon.
Alex, look, to catch up with you guys, bring back all the memories of my growing up in the industry, just missing out on my radio job, by accident getting into the television side, my love of film at the theatre, my love of newsreels, and all those little tracks that you've been giving me over the years.
Thank you, Gordon Bennett.